Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Heather Arneson. I'm a PhD student in aerospace engineering, working with Cedric Langbort. So this afternoon we're doing our panel discussion. We've got a few different questions that we'd like to cover over the course of the next hour, hour and a half. We'd like to talk about communicating scientific results to non-scientific communities and to the general public, transferring theory and results in the fields of communications control, signal processing, and signal processing to the sciences such as bioscience, neuroscience, energy, and economics. And we'd also like to discuss connecting academics with real-world applications. So hopefully we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes to talk about each of these subjects. I've got some questions prepared, but this is a discussion, and we'd really appreciate a lot of audience participation in thinking about these questions. With us on our panel today, we have Professor Doug Jones. Professor Jones is a professor in electrical and computer engineering and the Coordinated Science Lab and the Beckman Institute. His research interests are in digital signal processing and communications, including non-stationary signal analysis, adaptive filters and beamforming, OFDM and DMT optimization, biologically inspired signal processing, and various applications including low-power wireless communications, MEMS sensory systems, and advanced hearing aids. Next, we have Professor Yoram Bressler. Professor Bressler is a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, the Department of Bioengineering, and the Coordinated Science Laboratory. His research interests include biomedical imaging systems, inverse problems, and statistical signal and image processing. Next, we have Professor Srinivas. He is an associate professor of industrial and enterprise systems engineering, the Coordinated Science Lab, and an affiliate of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. His research interests lie in the area of modeling, analysis, control, and performance evaluation of discrete time, discrete event systems. His other interests include the use of machine learning, approximate algorithms, and online algorithms for the synthesis of near-optimal policies for various problems involving discrete state and discrete event systems. Then we have Dr. Tony Phillips. Tony Phillips is a senior technical leader at Ford Motor Company and has responsibility for Ford's advanced vehicle control system development for all electrified vehicle applications. His research interests include vehicle energy management, distributed systems control, and control system development tools and methods. He holds 29 U.S. and international patents in automotive controls. And finally, we have Professor Olga Milenkovic. She is an assistant professor in electrical and computer engineering in the Coordinated Science Laboratory. Her research interests include analysis of algorithms, bioinformatics, error control coding, constraint coding, and information theory, signal processing, and compressed sensing. She has to leave early, so she's going to be around for about the first 40 minutes of the discussion.
Those are all the first questions.
That's the only questions in there.
So starting off our topic of communicating scientific results to non-scientific communities and the general public. The first question is, scientists and engineers tend to use language aimed at their peers rather than the media or the public. How does our communication have to change in order to help the public understand the importance and potential benefits of our work?
So maybe I could speak from experience, and I think it's a shared responsibility on both sides, both our responsibility as scientists and engineers and the responsibility of the media to provide the people to work with us to help us convey the message in a way which can reach our audience. And my experience was in trying to work with, twice actually, with reporters who wanted to do a piece on my research. And it was a learning experience, I think, for both sides, although probably more for me than the reporter, because the reporter was an expert reporter. He deals with writing science pieces for his journal. So he has done this many times with other engineers, and he knows that what we like to do is rave about the wonderful details of our research, which really are of little interest to the general public. The general public wants to get the high-level picture, wants to know the benefits, and wants something exciting. So he was able to help me rephrase what I was telling, rewrite the story in a way which became, I think, a reasonably good piece when he wrote it up. Without him, I probably would not have been able to do it, or would have taken a lot of effort. So I think it's a learning experience, and it takes both sides to do this. We could probably teach this in courses. We could probably have a writing course which is devoted to writing for the popular media, and that might be a good way to do it.
Yeah, maybe I can add a few comments too. So I entirely agree that I think you need to focus on the benefits, because trying to focus on the details is something that the general population won't be able to comprehend. So if you focus on the impact and the benefits, I think that will be useful, and then people can understand and be excited about what you're doing. A couple of things I would say is that one that I've learned as being part of Ford, one is that you need to, it's important to be able to market your work. So, and I mean that not with any kind of bad connotations, but you need to be able to clearly describe what you do and why it's important, because otherwise you'll get drowned out in the noise. And so that's a big part of the work I do, is making sure that the people that are the influential people within the company understand what I'm doing and why that's important. And so being able to communicate it well is important. Along that line, one thing I learned along the way is that you need to have various versions that can describe your work. You need to have your so-called elevator speech ready, because you never know when you're going to step in the elevator with an influential person, and you're only going to have the time it takes to go up to the next floor to tell them what you work on. So you need to be able to describe it in a minute or less, and succinctly, and yet give them some kind of appreciation of it. You know, and you also need sort of a 5-minute speech and maybe a 20-minute speech, so for people who have more time to stand around and drink beer with you or something.
So I would like to zoom in on two words I heard. One from Yoram saying the public wants to hear certain things, and the marketing was the second word I would like to point out. The problem is, it seems to me, whenever I talk to someone who wants to write an article about the research you're doing, is that they expect to hear something very bombastic. You're going to change the world. So I saw an article that appeared on our webpage saying, "I can cure cancer." Disclaimer, I cannot. And I think the reason why this type of misunderstanding comes about is because there is a huge issue of honesty, academic honesty. So when I talk about my work, I would like to say I'm starting to do something and I want to market it, but I want to be completely honest about how far did I get in there. So people expect to hear very groundbreaking news all the time. And I think in the process they start losing the feeling how hard it is to make groundbreaking progress in research these days, especially. If you work in biology, it takes a long time, a coordinated effort of many, many people to make a tiny advancement in terms of cancer research, let's say. And the public won't be that excited to read an article which says, oh, we were able to cure, let's say, several cases of cancer in some mice, and we haven't made any more progress on that. That doesn't sound that exciting to them, but that's how research goes. And I think we all have to be very honest in terms of what we pretend or what we would like to work on, how far we manage to go into our research. And then maybe the public will respond and there would be some feedback that in the end will be beneficial for all. And it would recruit people to work in certain areas. Because if you read all these bombastic news that says, you can cure cancer, I can cure cancer, why even get into that area? Why even bother? You should have an honest picture of what is going on, and an honest understanding that it's hard to understand certain topics. So these promotional articles that talk about research in general, being excited, should just trigger your imagination and make you think, do you want to learn more, read more scientific articles, read more that is out there in the literature, and not just blindly look at that one article and think that's all you have to know and it's a groundbreaking result. And I think that's a big issue in research nowadays, that everything has to sound very bombastic, and hence it has to be watered down and inaccurate in many ways. So as a result, I suggest you all be very honest and tell people that it's very hard to make progress, and that's normal.
I have to call my uncle now.
Why? Oh. You were the one that told me you heard I can cure cancer.
So how do you, recently there was a whole, I don't want to use the word scandal, we'll just use the word scandal for the emails that got leaked regarding climate change, and everyone, and regardless of how people in this room feel about climate change or not, there was an article that got leaked or emails, sorry, that were sent to the professors. And I think one of them used the word trick, which probably was some mathematical way to solve, some mathematical tool. There's one portion, and it sort of feeds the science skeptics that exist. I can only speak for the U.S., but it seems that there are a lot of people who they don't understand science are very skeptical, and it hurts science. It hurts our ability as engineers and scientists to make progress because we get drowned out, whether it's things like climate change or it's things like teaching evolution in schools, which are two examples that were cited in an article. So how do you, is there something that, I totally agree that it's important, we shouldn't have to water things down. We should be able to say, here's the progress we've made, and we should be able to trust that the media, our public, can understand that it's okay to say that we made this much progress, that's still a good thing, and not to say, oh, well then, what are you doing? So I guess the question is, what can be our role as community or your roles as professors or in industry to try to influence the public and how they perceive what scientific progress is, or be able to understand our language, if you will.
I think in the particular situation you mentioned, I mean, part of the problem is the public doesn't understand the actual process, and so in some sense they don't understand that, and maybe it's part of the way that Geetha mentioned. We kind of communicate this as like, we've accomplished this, and it just sort of goes out as a fact, and it's not made as clear to the public that a lot of stuff we just don't know the answers yet, or we know partial things, or we think these things and we're just not sure. And science is not kind of this, stepping from surety to surety, but it's a series of kind of, you might say, layered confidences. You're very confident about some things and less confident about other things, and we're not at all sure about these other things. And so in some sense, I think it's the lack of the public understanding that that's just kind of how the process goes. In essence, the community, I think, has a, in essence, as a general goal of all of us is to make sure that we don't sort of convey a false, idea about, how the progress works. It doesn't go from certainty to certainty, but there are uncertainties there, and that's, I think, what Geetha's saying, which is that we need to be very honest. So I think that's the key thing, is we just have to make sure that we convey the process, the process and the challenges along with the results. And again, it's not something any one person can do, but I think sort of we all have to do that as kind of regular public communication, so that people don't get kind of a wrong sense of how science is actually done, or how it progresses, or kind of what is the state of knowledge is, so that they can kind of appreciate these nuances. And I guess I might say, sort of back to the original question, is in some sense, I think the key thing in the end is that if we want to communicate effectively, we have to tell people not necessarily what's interesting to us, but what's interesting to them. And so in some sense, I give some algorithm. I was fascinated with the fact, I can do this with 3 iterations instead of 2, and so the mathematical details of it really intrigue me, because I know them and I'm interested in them. But that's not really what's interesting to the person you're communicating to. So they're interested in the fact that their cell phone their battery might last 30% longer or something. So in some sense, I think maybe the most important thing to communicating, along with sort of communicating honestly, and is to sort of identify what is it that's, how's our research interesting to the people we're possibly communicating to, and then focus on that aspect of it. In the same way, if you go to a bar and you have a conversation with somebody, and you have a different conversation with this person you do with this person, because their interests are different. And so we sort of do that naturally when we interact with people in a casual conversation. We sort of tend to try to talk about things in a way that identify their interests and talk to them. Somehow in our scientific communication, we tend not to do that so much. And again, I think that's kind of what we have to do, is just look and try to figure out what aspect of what we're doing is interesting to them, and then sort of focus on that aspect. And it's not necessarily, it's not being deceptive or anything like that. It's really just basically a matter of kind of, there's a lot of things we could talk about. Let's talk about the part that interests you.
So just recommend, for those of you that like to read in your spare moments when you don't do research, there's an excellent book out called Plastic Fantastic, or Fantastic Plastic, in any order, so you have 2 permutations. And it talks about a big research scam from Bell Labs. You probably remember it several years ago, when a German physicist claimed he came up with a new way of designing transistors using plastic. And the whole book is basically a dissection of the media frenzy that followed his findings, and that talks about how research results are disseminated to the public these days, and how flawed the process is. So it has a very nice discussion. It's written by a journalist who spent several years talking to people at Bell Labs. And it gives you a nice understanding. When you read the book, you start to understand what is behind this issue of communicating your findings with the public and with talking to journalists, because a lot of journalists pushed that agenda in terms of promoting his work, which turned out to be all flawed and faked at the end, in terms of just really focusing on something they believe to be true and wanted to be true, and not paying attention to the details and not really getting a second opinion. As Doug and Yoram said, it's always good to have several people collaborating your results or your theory. So if you talk with one researcher, you want to get another researcher to say that this approach probably makes sense. So the best articles, I think, are written in terms of collecting a group of researchers from different institutions that work on that problem, and then get their feedback and their opinion, and then let the intelligent reader figure out where is the truth really and all that, and how good of a problem that is if several people give you different insights. So, but I really recommend that book. It's really, for all of us researchers, a very nice experience to read, and gives very nice ideas of what's going on out there.
Another question along these lines that we were interested in is how does the way in which engineers communicate their results to the public and politicians affect policy decisions?
Well, I would certainly say if the communication is kind of ineffective, then it gets ignored. So, I mean, maybe the foremost thing is we have to communicate effectively, or basically we won't have communicated at all. And so in some sense, I think it's one concern is if we tend to communicate in kind of very sort of technical. People are like, well, I don't get that. If we don't communicate in a way that sort of highlights the relevance for, again, in terms of the concerns of their concerns against the people, then they're going to think, well, this isn't very. It's not something I need to know because it doesn't affect our GDP, or it doesn't affect economic growth, it doesn't affect jobs or something like that. So I think first and foremost we have to make sure that we communicate kind of the relevance of it, and then we have a chance of being listened to.
Yeah, I think there is also an issue of, following on what Doug said, relativism of truth. So we have to admit that things are not known perfectly or are imprecise. On the other hand, politicians, for them to be able to act on scientific fact, it's very hard for them to process uncertainties. And if there are uncertainties, for them it's very difficult to sell an idea based on science to the public. If that science itself, if the scientists are saying, well, we don't really know, why do you want to take action on this? Why do you want to invest money in climate change if it's not really proven beyond a shadow of a doubt? So I think we have to phrase our statements in a language which does lead to possible action, and we have to be able to somehow provide a threshold of decision that we believe that a certain answer is true with very high probability. We should provide some way to convey that notion of probability or degree of certainty, which will lead to action.
So just one comment. I once talked with the program manager in the National Science Foundation. He said, senators love when they see movies of about your research. So it's very hard for us to make a case, I guess, for some of us, that we are doing some groundbreaking work that the senator will be able to understand and really absorb. The point is they're looking for things that are very quick, that can be quickly understood and that appeal to their senses in many different ways. So the program manager told me one specific senator was very charmed by movies made in Africa, antelopes running around, and then shot from the left, shot from the right, and he says, we're doing really serious environmental work. And that's all he cared about. He says, great, this project is great. People are doing amazing work. See, movies with antelopes running around and all that stuff. So, if you want to present our work to some senator who is a little bit short-sighted like that, the presentation is very important, because the people that make decisions about funding at the highest level usually don't have the time nor the potential nor the desire to engage that much into details. So for them, you really have to do the eye-catching and presentation-oriented approach in order to get their attention. And that's something people that do theoretical research should always have in mind. We cannot show senators formulas and things like that. If you get a movie with running animals or something like that, yeah, population dynamic studies or anything of that form, but no, nothing with formulas in there.
Does anybody else have? Anyone use the mic there?
This question is, I guess, is kind of the other side of the question. So, what do you think is the popular perception of work is going to affect us, both in the large scale, that like for our engineer as a whole community, or for each individual? So basically, how the
Yeah, well, in the end, I mean, somebody else is paying. I mean, is paying your salary and allowing you to be an engineer. So if you're an academic, then we're getting research funding from the federal government generally, or other governments, and so we have to convince a tax-paying public that their money that it takes money to take money out of their pocket and give it to us to do this research. In the end, if we can't convince them of that, we're not going to get funding, or the funding is going to be small. Even if you're working in industry in a company, and if you can't convince at least your manager or the board of the company or something that this idea you have for a new type of car or a new type of whatever is actually going to work and make money for the company, you're not going to get to work on that. In fact, you might not even keep your job because they may decide to lay you off. So in some sense, in the end, your ability to communicate the value of what you're doing, again, in terms that are relevant to the people who are actually supporting it, is essential to being able to continue to do that, unless you have to be independently wealthy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, being in a company is, in a lot of ways, the same kind of situation as you guys find yourselves in. Instead of appealing to the government, we're appealing to the people who run the company, that what we're doing is important, and we don't have that much time with them, so we need to be succinct and clear and make them understand what the benefits of this work are and why it's important to do this work. It's very similar.
I mean, just a follow-up to the whole sequence of thoughts, right? You're singing for your supper one way or the other, so you have to, first of all, convince the person who's paying you that they're getting something in return. Those are all things that don't need any explication. You guys know it. We don't need to say it. Couple of things that we would expect if we had an educated population in front of us, properly schooled in their, high school onwards and stuff like that. What we engage in, my personal view, is a form of it's an intellectual equivalent of a bench press. Okay, it's highly idealized. Show me one place in real life where you're going to be lying flat on your back. In my case, it's about 250 pounds. That's how much I weigh. And you're going to go back and forth till you get muscle fatigue. And then there's another guy who will grab it just when you're ready to give it. There's never a real life application. But every workout place would have a bench press set up in there. What we do in the university is the intellectual equivalent of a bench press, and we don't have to be apologetic about it. If people don't figure that out, I think we should kind of educate them that there is a purpose for intellectual equivalent of bench presses. As an applied mathematician, that's what I do, and I'm not ashamed about it. And I don't think you should either. But all we have to do is to somehow sell this concept that it's highly idealized and we are doing something of great value. We build pectoral muscles, so when I go out and fight a bear, I can fight it. That's the whole point. I mean, at the end of it all of education is an abstraction in some sense. And somehow this overwhelming thing of immediate relevance and so on and so forth, it has to be done tastefully. And I'll put a spin on what Olgitsa is saying. Some of it's done rather tastelessly in the whole concept. And we need to kind of have our own sense of aesthetic in here. Just the right amount, no more, no less, and just back off. And I think we'll get there. And I think we're kind of there. I tend to look at it very optimistically. It's okay. There's no need to bellyache that much, I think. But
I don't think, I think we're sometimes a little too critical of the general public. I mean, certainly, the public would be better off if we had, if we had sort of a better understanding of general science stuff. But, we're all pretty limited too. I mean, if I have a PhD in electrical engineering, I'm a very educated person. But, my chemistry knowledge doesn't, I know very little about biochemistry. I mean, I can, I know, or you can pick such about cars, for example. Mechanical engineering, I don't know that much about it. So in some sense, even as educated as I am, my ability to really sort of understand a sophisticated discussion about something that's happening in the mechanics of, something electrical vehicles or, biochemistry or cancer research or something is very limited in spite of that education. And if you look at the vast, the vast amount of knowledge that's out there, we simply can't expect, the majority of our listeners, no matter how educated they are, to have a deep grasp of the subtleties of what we're doing. So I think, it's just because of the size of knowledge, we have to be ready and able and willing to kind of say, look, I'm going to talk to you at a very basic level of what's going on, and we can't sort of blame it on them and say, well, it's your fault for being stupid about this. I'm stupid about, pretty much everything except for my little, double E arena, and so, why should I expect other people to, know that much about the kind of how sophisticated mathematics that we do, if I don't know that much about kind of, how cancer drugs work or something like that. So again, I think we really have to keep in mind that, we're asking an awful lot of people to understand these, and we really have to kind of take the, the largest step.
A saying I heard one time is that they give you a bachelor's degree when you think you know everything, and they give you a master's degree when you realize you don't know anything, and they give you a PhD when you realize that nobody knows anything. And so it sort of goes along with what you're saying, and I think maybe for those of you who are getting a PhD, and we'll get to that point, you can use that to your advantage and tailor your discussion to the fact that nobody knows anything, right? And you need to be able to talk in a way that's clear to people who aren't going to know a lot about what you're doing.
I think most people understand that it's good to communicate with the general public. But for me, as most of, I think the most thing I concern is just to survive. So
that's not good advertising.
I think for students and postdocs, the most concern is papers and there is no enough incentive for us, to communicate with the general public.
That's true, but as soon as you get out to become a professor, your ability to get a grant proposal will be dependent on you being able to write a grant proposal that's convincing to people who aren't necessarily experts in your field. Your ability to get hired in industry, and at least to get promoted in industry, is going to depend on your ability to communicate well to people. So you may not need those skills right now, but your next job, that'll be one of the key determinants of your success, if not the most important determinant of your success.
Yeah.
So just as you're here today, I mean, as a student, we're in school not because the homework assignments the students do are themselves actually, solving any useful problem. What you're doing is exercises to sort of, when you actually go get a real job, you will be able to do something useful. Similarly, I wouldn't sort of leave the issue of learning how to communicate effectively to a broader audience until you need to do it, lest you find that you won't be successful when you need it. And just sort of comment on that. So one of these questions was, how are you going to get better at that? For me, actually, the thing that's been most useful has actually been trying to talk to people, like explain to my wife what I'm doing and make it interesting. Explain to my mom. That's kind of what I tell people is, if you can't explain what you're doing to your mom and make it kind of interesting and get the basic idea across, so you understand why it's what you're doing, what's important, then you're not able to communicate effectively. And so same thing in party. Can you sit down at a bar next to somebody and someone who's any kind of job or whatever, someone's not they just have a college degree, and give them an interesting explanation of what is it you're working on, and put it in some kind of terms that at least sounds kind of interesting to them. You can carry on a conversation. And honestly, it's just trying to do that again and again at parties, sort of out socially, with family and stuff like that, and failing for years has actually made me a lot better. And the thing is, you don't want to, so you'll find it the first 10 times you try, they're like, oh, and they quit talking to you. But don't take that as a sign that, okay, I'm not going to try anymore. I'm just going to say, well, I'm just an engineer. Take it as a sign that next time, try to say it in a different way next time. You do this 10 times, and no people will just be lost or they'll lose interest. The 11th time, or maybe the 20th time, people ask, oh, that's kind of interesting, tell me more. And then you know you're getting somewhere. So seriously, I mean, actually try talking about what you're doing with people who aren't technically experts, who aren't people in this room, and try to make it interesting to them. Find that sort of angle on it, that hook, that way of explaining it where they actually get it, something out of it, and they actually are interested in it. And trust me, it is possible to, I mean, if you're interested in it, there is a way to make it interesting to them. And once you find that, you'll find that that's actually your sort of key to being able to effectively communicate. In other words, don't give up. Just keep trying. And you'll find it.
Following up on that, see if you can get a date that way.
Well, let's not go too far.
Okay, in the interest of time, let's move on to our next topic. The transfer of theory and results in the fields of communications, control, and signal processing to the sciences such as bioscience, neuroscience, energy, and economics. Currently, how are theory and results transferred to these fields? Do researchers in biosciences, neuroscience, etc., seek out engineers to help apply theory to their problems, or do engineers recognize the potential benefits of using theory using the theory of communications, control, and signal processing to these fields and seek opportunities to collaborate? Which way does that generally go?
It's usually pull rather than push. So they need something and they seek it out. Often they don't even talk to us. They kind of read about it, learn the basics somehow, and sort of do it themselves, which is too bad.
So I agree with Doug a lot. They are much more willing to rely on their own potential and knowledge. They go and read a little bit, the most basic things they can dig out. And they usually don't come to talk to us. It's us that have to reach out to them, and with a rather good story, which brings us down to the marketing part at the beginning. Because if you have to communicate with the biologist, that can be a lot of hard work. Yeah. So you better learn how to explain to them why something you're working on may be useful for their research area. Yeah. And that means someone has to start the first step in bridging the gap between the communities and learn something about the subjects and the terminology. And I think usually the experience is that engineers are the ones that have to do the first step, because it's too much to expect from biologists to start learning about our cute algorithms and our mathematical theories, because that's way far removed from what they're doing. We are much more naturally inclined to understand their problems because they're very logical and very clear and very easy to put in a mathematical framework if you just know what the right words mean in the right context. So you really need to do that. You need to learn some terminology, read some papers with the help of possibly friends that can explain at the beginning what things mean in that, and then just try to go to them and talk to them and tell them that you believe you have a way to solve something or help them solving something.
I'd second that. I think often biologists are not aware of the possibilities. They have some solution which sort of works. They don't know that something could be done much better. They have no idea. And therefore we have to reach out, understand their problem, and say, hey, this could be done in a different way. Let's try. And I think we have to be the ones who offer that. In my mind, an engineer, the definition of an engineer is someone who looks at the world and sees everything broken and wants to fix it. Most people don't see it that way. And so we have to be the ones who initiate action in improving things, I think, at least very often.
Yeah, having sort of engaged in collaboration with a lot of biologists and biomedical in a lot of different areas, I've kind of learned some of the, I have my list of what I think are kind of the secrets for how to collaborate, and so I'll maybe give a couple minutes to kind of tell you what I've kind of discovered. So a lot of times it's them coming to me, and I'm sort of fortunate that I've kind of, it took a number of years, but gotten to where people sort of, actually sometimes they'll bring problems. Sometimes people will bring problems to you. You'll find out about problems, and you can go talk to people who have them. The key thing to keep in mind is kind of, you got to think of it from their perspective. They don't care about engineering. They don't care about algorithms. They got problems they need to solve. And so if they're talking with you, if you want to collaborate with them, then you have to basically help them solve their problems. And the second thing is that things never work out of the box. None of these algorithms, if anyone's done any real engineering knows that, nothing just kind of works completely off the shelf. You can't take something straight out of the textbook. You got to tweak it a little bit and stuff like that. So if you want things to So you, and in the end, you have to understand your application to actually sort of apply something in the real world. You have to understand that application to a substantial amount. So often that in these other fields, basically it's your collaborators, the biologists, or who have the understanding of that application. So you basically need to get access to that. You basically need to collaborate with them, interact with them enough to kind of learn enough that they can sort of find out what you need to do. Because your own sales, a lot of times the big issue is they don't know that they need you. They don't know that they could use you. And so part of what you have to do is kind of talk with them, find out kind of what it is their problems are, and then basically kind of translate that into some kind of form that you can make use of. But the other thing that's just really key, and I've seen so many potential collaborations that are really promising, break down the following way. The problem is that often what they need is very, very basic. So a number of times people come to me and they have some, they're trying to solve some really, important scientific, scientific problem. And essentially, when you sort of balls all that and you find out what they need is a filter. They need a standard FIR filter, an EC kind of 410 kind of thing. And so, you're all want to collaborate because you're like, oh man, I get to do this great research. I need new problems. I need some cool research to do. And you're going to find out what they want you to do is design an FIR filter and implement it, because they don't know how to do that either. And so what do? You say, oh, that's trivial. That's just MATLAB. Here's what you do. Go get this software package called MATLAB, and there's this run this program and design a filter, and then come back to me when you got an interesting problem. and they say thanks, but the problem is that okay. That's what they should do, right? And it is trivial to someone who's trained like you. But to them it would take 6 months of going and taking EC 410 and reading all these textbooks and stuff just to be able to do what you just told them to do. And so what I've seen many, many problems break down where it stops because it's not research for the engineer and so or the mathematician, so they don't do it. They just say, go do this. But it's too much for them to do, and so you kind of get lost in this kind of, we call it the valley of death or something, this place where sort of this connection isn't made. So the thing I've learned is if you really actually seriously want to start getting collaborations with people in these other fields, you've got to go do kind of the basic stuff where you got to say, all right, yeah, this is trivial, but I know they don't know how to do MATLAB, so I'm going to write the MATLAB program for them. I'll design a filter. I'll run it on the data. I'll give them this little script and say, here, and teach them how to use it, and say, okay, here's, and you solve their problem. And the thing is, you have to get over the fact that, and sort of accept the fact that your first contribution, your first paper, is not going to be a groundbreaking paper in electrical transaction signal processing. You're going to be second author or third author on a paper in biology. And you got to accept, but still, that can be an important paper, right? So you just have to accept the fact that your contribution, recognize you are making this important scientific contribution. It's just not in your discipline, okay? And so if you're willing to kind of do that and go that step, and if you actually sort of succeed and you actually get it working, then actually now you've gained their attention and you've gained their respect, and you've helped them, so now they value you. Now they're willing to spend the time with you, to spend those hours it takes to talk about their problems and explain to you what exactly their real issues are. And then it's the next time around that then they actually bring to you the problems. You get the face time and the interaction time to kind of learn enough about their problems to identify those that actually become interesting in your domain as well. And you just simply have to make that investment, and otherwise these things just die. So again, kind of, so the secret is just, take that step. Do the routine stuff for them that's routine for you, but is hugely impossible for them. Allow them to sort of make their contribution, and then use that leverage as a vehicle then to kind of get the time to interact with them, to learn their application enough that you can then actually sort of identify problems that become more challenging, more interesting. Yeah. And if you can do that, then you're actually in. The other thing that happens too, as I've discovered, is that once someone, they're very appreciative if you can solve their problems, and they tell their friends and their other colleagues. So once you've sort of done that once, successfully once, you get lots of other people coming to you saying, oh, because so-and-so says, oh, hey, go talk to this Doug Jones guy. He's actually pretty good. He helped me solve this problem. And so then actually you kind of get in the loop, and you get kind of a reputation, and then you can actually sort of move forward. So that's really the secret if you really want to kind of collaborate in these other disciplines, is you got to sort of help them solve their problem, and then kind of just hang on with enough patience and stuff to actually learn what their applications are, and then you can identify opportunities, and then you develop enough credibility. You can say, oh, by the way, why don't we try this? Here's, I got another algorithm for you. This is an exciting algorithm. Can we try that? And they're like, sure. You solved the problem before, so they're willing to kind of give you a chance. And they said, okay, that. So again, that's what I've just kind of discovered a secret to kind of get the collaborations with people in those other disciplines.
Yeah, maybe I can follow on that a little bit. I mean, it's amazing how much our jobs are alike, and for the fact that they're so different. But even though I don't routinely interact with bioscientists or neuroscientists, I have many of the same experiences, or at least where I've learned the same kind of lessons as you've just described. So in my case, I'm working in research and advanced engineering within Ford, but I need to interact with a lot of other departments and organizations within Ford. And of course, one thing I need to do is work with my product development customers, so people I expect to take my technologies and put them into production. And so I've learned a lot of the same lessons you just described, that in order to build the bridges with these people, you need to go do their work for them. Okay, so they have challenges of their own that are not research, that are not that interesting from a research perspective, but they need that work done, and they need help, and so you need to go work with them and solve their problems for a while until you gain their respect. And once you gain their respect, then they'll call you and they'll tell their friends about you, and the next thing you'll be in the loop, right? And so that's a very common lesson, that you just need to be able to build bridges. You need to help other people and work in their environment and talk their language for a while, walk in their shoes, if you will, and that'll get you in, and then you'll be able to build that bridge. So I can't emphasize that enough.
So if I can just say something before I leave, I couldn't agree more with what Doug was saying. It's absolutely right. And the question we usually ask, because we are so hard-pressed with publishing and getting funding, whenever you talk with someone, you look at them, and they start morphing into dollar shapes or anything else like that you imagine you want to have at that time. So when you talk to a biologist and they get really excited, they say, that can be a science paper, this could be that. And all of us are thinking in some way when we start a collaboration, what's in there for me? They think what's in there for them, oh, a science paper. We are thinking biology equals dollars, because all funding agencies want to do that, want to fund that. And in the process, we sort of lose the fact or the understanding that the question shouldn't be what's in there for me. That exactly what Doug said, you have to build some trust. Sometimes you can go a whole year, and that happened to me, go a whole year without getting anything published or doing anything where the dollars keep coming in, or the science paper keep pouring out of the publication press. You just sacrifice a lot of time and energy to learn, to talk to people, to help them out without asking anything in return, which is unselfish, and it's not the question that you're asking, what's in there for me. So that in the end, when they understand that you're there not just because you want to get some publications and money, but honestly, maybe you're there because you really like that set of problems. It's not also showing them on top of everything else that you enjoy doing it, and this is something you're really interested in doing in the long run. Then finally, occasionally, basically, there comes a time when you get this amazing problem and you can't believe how nice it is, and they're so willing to help you, and they call you up to visit them, and it just boils down to a great experience. But as I said, you should never think of the short-term gain, what's in there for me. Even if there is no publication, even if there's something very trivial for you to do, you don't ask for anything in return. You just show them that you are doing this because you really want to be helpful and you really care. And that's the whole point, because they get excited when you are excited about the subject, and they will keep coming back to talk to you because you show a genuine interest. Even if it is a filter, you say, oh, this is interesting, I learned something about biology. Yes, for us it's a filter, but I didn't know that the biological system would require something of that form, and that's still interesting, and I like it. And you just continue that way until one day you hit a bingo, and you get some really exciting problem that when your brain doesn't count dollars anymore or think of papers, but it's just absorbed with this idea of finding the ultimate truth and not what's in there for me. So I think that should be sort of a nice way to do research. Never think of publications. I know it's very idealistic, but if you really like the work you're doing and if you really believe in something, hopefully the results will come out without you forcing that as the main point or main reason to go into that.
You have to think of it, but you can't, in the longer run, but in the short run, you can't sort of ask, like, what's in it to me by tomorrow.
Yeah,
So you have to
what's in there for me, it's an investment. Yeah. And it's a good investment. It's a great investment when you do real science and physics, biology, neuroscience. So those areas
you get
are
access to problems that no one else in your community gets access to because you're the only person who's established that.
And that's excellent, because then you can take all your time, because I think sometimes you're also forced to run with problems because there's so many people very smart people doing that type of work. And here you have your own private, personal biologist who comes in and says, I saw this thing happening in the lab and I have no idea what this means and this problem, how could... So you know no one else probably is going to work on it. You have all the time, you can think about it, and it's really a lot of fun to do it. I think it's not about the dollar signs and the science publications, that comes later, but it's beautiful. And as RS said, you have to have your own sense of aesthetics, and you pick the problems based on that and what you like to do or not.
Yeah.
I have a comment that I'd like to I come from mechanical engineering and here working in kind of collaborating in a neuroscience lab application, EEG, brain imaging training. One thing that all of us control engineers learned when we started was we had no idea how to run these experiments. We did it all wrong 3 times before we finally found the right parameters. Do you guys have any experience with this? This is kind of the opposite thing of what Ben was saying. We have to be patient and do simple problems for trying to know the answer to. Do you have any comment about the other way around for an experience dealing with learning things in another field in order to...
I started, I mean, for me, you know, some of my early collaborations were actually with people who are basically trained in science. And, you know, I'm never quite fully appreciative for it. I'm really an engineer at heart, and just the kind of the whole way they think about things and kind of, you know, what's important in designing of experiments and stuff is alien to me, actually, to be honest. And I would get kind of frustrated. You know, they're like, well, how are we going to check and see if this algorithm, you know, this is really working better, making people hearing anything? How are we making people hear better? And I'm like, well, we just program it up and put it on a listen, and you know, I mean, come on, guys, let's get moving here. And they're like, no, we have to design these, you know, human subject experiments very carefully. And I get very frustrated, frankly, with kind of, we'd spend these, you know, weeks, literally weeks, talking about exactly how we're going to set up these experiments. And it actually took me a couple years to actually finally, you know, start to appreciate the value of that. In other words, in the end, that actually their experiments, by carefully designing experiments, they actually learn something from their experiments. I've learned in retrospect that sort of in the first 10 years of my career here that I thought I was doing these wonderful tests of all my, you know, algorithms and stuff like that. You know, looking back, anything I did, you know, back then, basically the only thing I learned was that my program was debugged. I mean, that's all I learned. I didn't really learn about whether this algorithm was any, you know, useful or really better for anything. All I know is to show that it kind of worked as a thought, because I didn't really know how to design, you know, careful experiments that would help you discriminate between not just is this working, but also are these other hypotheses, I mean, does it rule out other hypotheses as well? So it took me a long time to kind of appreciate that. So I certainly gained value by kind of learning that, but it took time. I'm not sure if that's answering your question or not, but.
Can I just comment on that? Wei is there, so just diagonally from you. He can give you a horror story of our first experience in the lab. When we started in the Keck Center trying to do some experiments, we thought we were on top of everything. We walk in there with this attitude, come on, those are biologists, we are smart engineers. How wrong can it go? After God knows how much spilled DNA, the fact that we didn't know you have to protect it from the light, that it has to be chilled all the time, we just let it stay there. The fact that they said how many nanomoles, and I'm looking at him, can you check online what was a nanomole again? I mean, what the heck? We were lost in space and time, and I think we were the laughing stock of the lab. This is, oh, look at those two. We come in with gloves. We didn't even know we had to wear gloves. They're very friendly people out there to help you, as long as you don't feel ashamed to say, listen, I don't know this. Can you help me? And we didn't even know how to turn on any of the devices there. And I'm so happy we didn't ruin anything. We would have never been able to pay that back. You just ask. And I think in a lab, if you want to learn, get some real experience in a lab, you have to be able to ask a lot of people and be very polite and very open about the fact that you really want to learn it, but you don't know anything. And then they give you manuals, they give you instructions. When you get really messed up and you don't know something, they would come in and help you out, show you how to fix it. And again, it's just patience, time, and the willingness to really go down to earth and say, I don't know it, and I need help. Because if you pretend you know all of it, it's usually going to be a disaster. And that was our attitude the first time we walked in there. We can do it, but 5 minutes later we knew we were going to mess everything up. So horror stories, we can talk more about that. And I'm sorry I have to take off. Sorry for the interruption.
We're PhDs in kind of what we do. But the thing is actually, I mean, our knowledge in some of these things is freshman level, right? And you wouldn't expect a freshman to be able to walk in and get this stuff right without some training. And sometimes we kind of expect a little too much of ourselves as well. It's sort of hard to forget that, and it's uncomfortable because we're used to being in our own little world kind of experts, and we kind of tend to stay in that little world because it's comfortable. But yeah, I mean, you just can't get around the learning curve.
It seems like at the foundational items it comes down to sort of maybe at first not having a lack of respect for another field that you're not a part of or their work. So for example, I'm a mechanical engineer doing controls. I do sort of a mix of theoretical and applied work, whereas most of the controls work at the university is very theoretical. We'll go to the American Controls Conference, and there's very few sessions on control applications. It's primarily theoretical. And I get the sense that there's sort of an underappreciation for applied work.
I appreciate it.
You can do a job too.
We obviously have to deal with equations, we learn all the same math, and we take the extra step, in my opinion, of actually figuring out how do I make this actually work. We try to address some of the barriers, not to the extent that we would in industry, but we try to get close to that, to actually say what does it mean to actually now test them on an experimental system, actually show that my controller works. And yet it's really frustrating, to me personally, to go to conferences and constantly feel like I can publish, but it doesn't seem like there's any appreciation within my own field. So if you have any comments on that, when you're doing work that's maybe outside the box within your area, is there a way for me to communicate to someone more the value, or do you just wait till people come around and maybe see the value in it?
I don't know, I feel that frustration a lot with some of our work too. I mean, all the stuff with the hearing aids, they've never been able to really publish in a traditional signal processing community. They just think it's, too applied versus theory. Which, there's a certain frustration with it. I think part of the other thing too, though, that I kind of come to realize is that, I mean, in the end, the question is where is, find where your work is going to be valued. So it took me a while to kind of get, I kind of think I'm a signal processor. I do this kind of signal processing application in hearing aids. I think this is really cool. I should tell my community. My community will love to hear about this. Actually, my community wasn't that interested in hearing about it. But actually, the hearing aid community was. And so you just have to kind of, in some sense, get used to the idea that part of your work how should I put it? Your community, the community that resonates with what you're doing may be a somewhat different community than the kind of academic community in which you're currently living or whatever. And so part of it may be try to identify the community that does. So maybe there's some people who are kind of more on the industrial side who really do value it, or maybe there's an application area where the new techniques you're developing are tremendously useful and valuable in this particular application domain, and it's so basically maybe you should be focusing kind of if you will, marketing and selling it as a to that community as a solution to their application problems, instead of trying to sell it as kind of a validation of, say, a sort of generic validation of control theory. So since, to me, the trick I think is to try to identify who's going to be particularly interested in that, and try to kind of figure out where, how to impedance match with their, with their interests. And it may be a different sort of community or a different set of journals than you're kind of used to.
When you say you feel underappreciated, in what context? I mean, is it that your peer group doesn't appreciate you, or the group that evaluates you doesn't appreciate you? Am I making sense? Where is the dissatisfaction coming from?
Somewhat like a peer group.
Okay.
I think sometimes it doesn't. I guess my impression is that sometimes it seems like other people don't perceive our work as very sophisticated. That if you're doing serious controls work, you should be your paper should be full of full of math, and that be a misperception on my part, absolutely. But or sometimes it's just disappointing to maybe go to a conference and you'd like for there to be more people who attend the talks on control applications, yet everything's pretty much focused on a different area. So it's just things like that. I don't mean to say that no one has appreciation for it. Absolutely not. I'm sure there's things too. But it's just sort of it's the general impression I've gotten after being I'm a fourth year apprentice.
I guess I don't think you should feel bad, because I've had those same feelings as you described, because obviously my work has been a lot more applied and very, very much not theoretical. And I've had the same feelings, though, like when I brought my stuff to conferences, like, this is a lot different than everybody else's paper. But it initially used to bug me a lot more, but now I don't really worry about it, because I know where the value of my work is. And I appreciate that, and frankly, I look at some other papers, I don't know where the value of that work is. So I think to myself, I know where my work is going and why it's valuable and what it's producing. I can't say that about some of this other work, so why am I worried about that?
So yeah, make sure you can try to see if you can try to plug into the the people who will take it and who will appreciate the value.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems, which I also faced at some point, was is that we're not exactly, as grad students, we're not exactly free to choose where we're going to publish, but we go with like what our advisor wants to publish. So then we get a lot of advice like, well, you know, I mean, we've done something really cool. It's a really cool application, but if we don't do all this theoretical derivation or proving of things, or then it will not get accepted. So we have to gear our work toward that side, which then is when it makes us feel like what we have done doesn't have enough value until you can make it look really complicated on paper. So
I totally agree with wanting to sell it to the right community, and you can do that within there, but there is some limit of if I want to establish myself as a controls engineer, I do need to publish in controls journals. I do need my work to be accepted for the controls community. So there's a balance between trying to figure it all out. But
well, try to look at it as an opportunity. So write 2 papers. Seriously, I mean, do one for the, do more theoretical stuff, do one for the own community, but the fact that you do have kind of an application, I mean, focus in the knowledge and the results there, may allow you to write a paper and, focus on a specific application and get, 2 papers out of it. And so, it's not a...
I mean, as you know, there are two journals. I mean, there's IEEE Transaction Automatic Control. That's kind of mathematical, I'd give you that. But there's also the Control Technology and Applications thing, which has published a huge number of, I implemented it and it worked, kind of papers. And the best thing is that when you really work, that's where you're going to get your consulting money from. And when you see that paycheck, you're going to be very happy. So we do our math, and then there's a consulting angle to the whole thing too. So, I mean, I think if you had, I don't know, if I was in your place, I have a lot of lacunae in my training, which I identified after I became a faculty member. So that whenever you see something lacking in your training, work on it. You would get your rewards. It's not a big deal. And if the paper doesn't get published, that's okay. I mean, there is a rebuttal process as a whole thing. We've all gone through all of it. But at the end of it all, the knowledge that you're going to gain in that process is either, you may not get a paper, but you'll get a fantastic consulting contract when you're a faculty member somewhere. So don't worry about it.
There's also part of this communication issue too. I mean, you have communities that are comfortable with kind of a particular way of describing stuff mathematically, and so, maybe it's not your preferred way of explaining it or talking about it, but I mean, still, you're trying to talk to a community, so you have to speak their language. And maybe in the application domain, again, you kind of have to, there may be some people who ought to be interested in your algorithm, but if you don't kind of take it to them and show them why this actually is really relevant for their specific problem, they're not going to notice it or pick it up either. So, again, substance, you can, at least that's how I kind of rationalize myself when I'm frustrated about it, is saying, just part of this is the communication thing. You've got to take a little extra step in these different directions to be able to cast things in the language and communicate to the community the value of that work. It takes more time, but again, sometimes you can get 2 papers out of it.
Yeah, I can relate to what you described, because I'm one of those faculty who ask their students to do what your advisor seems to be asking you. So you have this great application. It seems to work. You've tried on data. It's great. But now your advisor wants you to actually derive some theory and prove that it works in general, or abstract it to a more general problem. I think that's part of the learning process. That's what we want our PhD students to be able to do, to actually take a particular instance, abstract it to a more general problem, use powerful tools that they have learned in theory to solve that general problem, and then go back and maybe find other applications where this can be applied. So I think that maybe is the difference between a master's student and a PhD student, at least in my mind. For a master's student, he goes, solves a particular problem, particular application, can publish a paper, great. For a PhD student, like them to be able to go back, reflect, look from a distance, see the generality of this, or generalize and find a powerful theory. So I think, and then in the end, yes, you can publish maybe 2 papers, maybe 3, because after you've gone to the theory, maybe you can come back and find another application, which is similar, although the applications look different. At the level of theory, they look the same because it's the same math, and suddenly you can solve more applications. So I think that's the kind of power we want to endow people with, and it can be painful, I can appreciate that, but I think it's a useful process.
One more question.
I think I would like to share my experience. It's also related to the topic. For me, basically, we have a beautiful theory, we have smart algorithm. We found that we have a powerful hammer. We just think, okay, we can go out to find some nails. But most of the times, our model just does not fit the data, the application. We think we found some wonderful application we can work on, and at the end of the day, we found, okay, my model just doesn't fit the data. So at that time, we have to kind of have to sit down and think very carefully to abstract this application in a proper way, such that we have to find some bridge, basically, to connect our theory and applications. That's just from my previous experience.
Okay, in the next 25 minutes or so, we'll move on to our final topic, connecting academics with real-world applications. We heard some details about this from Tony Phillips this afternoon in his presentation. Maybe we'll get into some other aspects of this. It often seems that in order to develop provable theoretical results for specific applications, so many assumptions and simplifications of the real system have to be made so that you can get results that the results are kind of no longer relevant to the problem that you're trying to tackle to begin with. How can we bridge this gap and develop theoretical results which are relevant to the real-world applications?
So maybe the first comment I would make is that in our applications, we don't look for provable results, right? So we apply techniques, and we bound them, I guess, in a way that we're sure that they're not going to be ill-performing. So it doesn't need to be bounded across the entire working space, because we know the working space is only this big, and so we just need to make it work there. And if it gets close to ill-posed within that space, then we switch to a different strategy. So it's very practical, in that we don't need to provide any kind of guarantees about performance or stability. Right? So that's the world I live in. I've never seen a stability proof within my company. Okay. So.
Yeah, I think that there is an apparent disconnect between theory and practice. Of course, when you develop theory, it is not going to apply exactly to any real situation. There is going to be model mismatch. So I think there are at least two things to be said about that. One, just the process of developing that theory and trying to prove something allows you to develop an intuition for the nature of the problem, because you find what are the assumptions you have to make to prove your result. That gives you an idea of the sensitivity of the problem, a qualitative sensitivity. What is your problem affected by? What assumptions did you have to make? What simplifications do you have to make for this to work? And that gives you insight, which you can then use in actually developing a practical application. The other is you may want to design for robustness. So if I think about a particular problem on which I worked as a PhD student, which was sensory processing. At that time, the model was, for example, you have a uniform linear array of sensors. You want to use that to find directions of radiating sources. And you could formulate that as a nice mathematical problem. There is an optimization problem to solve, which is difficult, but you can find approximations which work and are provable in some sense. But then, and there were a number of years of research, many millions of dollars from DARPA that funded this work. And finally, no one was using these results. People continued to use a method which is known as beamforming, which is very simple and very robust. So robustness was the killer for this method, because all these high-powered methods relied on very accurate models, and they were not robust. So I think what we have learned, and of course other disciplines have learned, is that you have to design for robustness. And then you can incorporate robustness into your theory, and your theory becomes more powerful and is able to handle model mismatch and work better in applications. Is it going to be perfect the first time? Probably not. Maybe you have to robustify in directions which you haven't thought about. But I think that it is possible to develop theory that is closely applicable to real problems by this process of looking for robust solutions.
Yeah, I sort of follow what you're saying. I mean, the modeling is you know, an absolutely key component of it. And in the real world, sort of in detail, the world is infinitely complex. So no model ever captures all the sort of complexity of the real world. And so, you know, so there's a little sign on one of the office doors up there, like, all models are wrong, some models are useful, or something like that, which is basically kind of true. And so in the end, what happens is when we model, you know, we start making these simplifying assumptions, we do that so we can make things tractable, we can actually sort of, you know, first comprehend it, and let alone be able to actually sort of analyze it. And so we start simplifying things. And as we simplify things, we're deviating from the way the real world is. And it turns out that, as Jeroen says, you know, some of these deviations don't matter very much. You know, we're a little bit off, and so maybe the thing works 2% worse than it might have otherwise, but who cares? It's not important. Other things are absolutely essential to the way things work, and if we sort of leave that out, it just totally breaks down and doesn't work at all. So, and so, in a sense, when it comes down to modeling, what it boils down to is models and analysis are going to be useful are ones where the model is simple enough that we can comprehend it and analyze it, but yet complex enough that it captures all the important things that are going on in the world well enough that it still pretty much kind of sort of works, and mostly, you know, it works almost as well if you kind of captured everything. And so the question is simply, how do we know which thing? So in the end, it really boils down to how do I know what I can leave out? You know, what can I simplify away, and what can't I simplify away? And unfortunately, I don't think there's necessary. You know, Jeroen gave some good sort of general guideline, which is, you know, we need to sort of not simplify away things that are too robust. Don't use models that depend so much on those assumptions. If a tiny deviation from that assumption will mean it will break down. But more often than not, it's hard to know. And you know, what I discovered again and again in my work is that, you know, I come in, I think I know what's sort of key. I sort of make these assumptions, I go and do it. But then when you try it on real data, you find out, wait a minute, this isn't working. And then you go in, you start looking through your data and kind of, you know, process the stuff, go in line by line and kind of see exactly where it's going on. And you realize it's breaking down because I thought that this simplification wouldn't matter very much. Uh-oh, it mattered a lot. Or here was a sort of, you know, why isn't this working? Well, because there's this thing going on in the signal which I didn't even realize was happening, and that's really important. That's really where all the action is. And so if I don't have that in the model, it's just not going to work. And in some sense, the problem is that you can't know what's going to matter and what's not going to matter, and without some kind of feedback loop, without sort of getting out there and really sort of messing around with some data. So what I discovered, particularly in the early part of my career, is you know, a lot of my stuff is kind of based on, in the literature, people use this model, and you just kind of assume that, well, if they're using this model, that must be a good model. And so if I do more work on that kind of model, that basically this will actually work on real stuff. Well, often it's not true, actually. Or I come up with my own idea, and I feel like I got great intuition. I remember this one thing I sometimes make like guesses, like, you know, what's the probability that I think that with this algorithm is going to work? I had one I was like 99% sure. I mean, I was totally 99% sure. I ran the data, it didn't work. I was like, what? It has to work. How can this not work? I'm totally sure it's going to work. And it took me a while digging through the stuff to kind of find out, well, I mean, so where I'd kind of like wrong. I sort of missed something. And it's still kind of surprising about it. But it just didn't work. But in the end, you know, it's that if we sort of just guess without kind of closing the loop, without going back to the application, kind of trying the stuff in the real data, in the real application, and not just kind of toy versions of the application, just simulations, but real data and stuff, we never really find out for sure whether that model is really capturing enough of what's going on in the real world to really be relevant to the problems. And so then you just kind of spiral off. You get all this work, paper after paper and paper in whole fields, and go off doing stuff that turns out never to be relevant, as Jeroen was saying, because it just turns out it's just missing something fundamental about kind of where it's too sensitive to kind of the deviations from the model of the real world. So in the end, I think there's no substitute for actually getting in there and working enough with real data to in some sense, validate. What you're really doing is you're validating your model. It's not you have to get out and kind of solve all the problems, pick all the parameters. You just have to basically find out whether your model is capturing enough of what's going on in the real world that it's actually designing to it or working to it is actually going to give you something useful. And I've found no substitute. I mean, you gain experience if you work with real data, and so, but there's no substitute for actually getting out and trying it. Because no matter how many times I've thought, I'm just totally sure that I know what's going on with this, I still find I get surprised all the time. So in some sense, that's why we have to sort of engage the application, is enough to kind of find out whether the model is valid or not. And if you do that, again, you'll find out sometimes that the model's not valid, but you also learn that, okay, well, I shouldn't have left that term out. I have to include that. But you may also find things you thought were essential in there you can leave out, which may simplify things. And so in the end, it's kind of make sure you close that loop with your real application. And somehow you got to find a way to kind of get hooked up into the application, or you have to collaborate with people, otherwise, but somehow get engaged enough with the application and with real data, touch real data, because your simulation model, usually your simulations work because they're generated by the model that you assumed, right? So touch real data, work with it, try your stuff out on it, and then go back and kind of, if it doesn't work, go in and dig into it and figure out why it doesn't work, and that will allow you to kind of find out what's essential in the model and what's not essential in the model. And again, the odds that your work will be relevant goes up from like 5% to 50% or something, because you actually then you close that loop. So again, to me, that's kind of the key secret. You have to get close enough to the real data, try it out on stuff, and you're doing it mainly just to validate your model. And then once you know what kind of matters and what doesn't matter, then go to town on the theory of that kind of stuff that matters. But then you won't spend a lot of your time, like I did for several years in kind of my early career, sort of spending time on things that turned out not to be very relevant in the end, because I just hadn't actually enough experience with the real stuff to know what kind of mattered and what didn't matter. And so that's, I think there's no substitute for that. And that's why you get involved in the application. It's not that because you necessarily want to go off and make a big contribution to the application domain, but if you want your theory to matter, then make sure you're engaged enough with the application to validate whether that theory is actually capturing what's the real, what the real problem is, what's really going on in the world, just enough that it makes a difference.
Yeah. So maybe a couple things that I thought of as you were talking. One is, I think a lot of the value in the advanced controls work for us, so for what we're doing with Infor, is just doing the analysis and trying to apply this, and then you learn from that process. So, for instance, if you saw my talk earlier today, when we did the dynamic programming, I showed how we learned how the dynamic programming moved the points around in the engine torque speed map to closer to the more optimal point. And then we can go back and look into more detailed data and say, well, what really happened with that data when dynamic programming shows these other operating points? What was it really doing in the details? And then we can do that analysis. And so even though we don't apply, of course, dynamic programming in real time in the vehicle, we can create an algorithm based on what the dynamic programming did. Okay, so we learned from the process of applying that, we learned what the underlying right thing to do was, and then we can apply that in a more implementable strategy. It's maybe not so sexy, but yet is effective. So that's one thing I was going to say, is that you can learn from the process of applying it, and even though the actual implementation doesn't look like that, you've learned from the process. The other thing I was going to say is that you're talking about using the real data and so on. I think some of the most effective collaborations I've had with my university colleagues are when we get involved early and not heavily, but at least engaged enough where we can make sure that their assumptions are valid. Because a lot of times they'll start out with assumptions that are really not valid and start going off, and if you don't correct that soon enough, they'll be way out in left field, and then everything will be for naught. But if you can get the assumptions all squared away at the beginning, then I think you can have a really powerful machine working for you, and they can deliver very high quality results that you can use and learn from again the same way.
Like Ogita was saying earlier, the carrot of this is sometimes you basically identify a problem that nobody ever kind of realized was the key issue. So what everybody thought was a key issue and was the only important thing, maybe not be the important thing, and maybe something else that's important. If you discover that by the process of trying to apply your stuff and figuring it out, then you got kind of a free pass because you're the only person who knows what the key issue is. So then now you can go ahead and spend a few years figuring out how to kind of build a model that sort of incorporates that and solve those kind of problems without competition from all the big shots who have 25 grad students and $1 million a year to kind of put on it and compete with you. In some sense, if all you do is go to literature and take models that other people, that you got from other papers, you're always just doing kind of, evolution or details on top of something else that somebody else discovered. Unless you actually can get down and kind of touch the application yourself enough to kind of see what's really going on, you're always going to be depending on somebody else's sort of assumption or somebody else's claim as to what the model ought to be. Again, if you go down into itself, sometimes you can sort of figure out what how you should be modeling. And so again, maybe that's something for you two as well. Is that again, because you're sort of messing with the application, you may have a chance of discovering some theoretical problems that nobody else has ever recognized before, and you may get kind of a free, a 3-year lead time to to develop those without anybody else competing with you.
I just have a counterpoint to all of this. Sometimes making an absurd mathematical model has some value. So here you say, well, there were these irrelevant things that became relevant and relevant things became irrelevant. Now, I'll just give you a simple vignette from the GE hot point makes the what is called a cal rod. That's the heating element that's on your stuff. It's usually like a helical thing. And then there's a little bend. If you opened your things, you would know, okay? So that's a company in Cicero, Illinois that I had dealt with. So they make the cal rods. It's a big, long sleeve. There's a heating element in the middle, and then they pour magnesium oxide around the whole thing, and they cook it. So it forms a glaze, like a glazed donut. And then they bend this whole thing out and put that little thing where the power end, And right at that bend, this nichrome wire used to touch the sleeve, and they had shorting failures, and they were scrapping at about 18% or something. And this was after all the work was done. All right, just bear with me. Okay, so here's magnesium oxide. So why is that happening when you did this glazing process? It didn't quite glaze properly, blah, blah, blah. So this thing is touching the sleeve. So we came in and said, everything is a sphere. Right? All the little magnesium oxide things, you look at them into the microscope, they're nowhere close to being spherical in shape. Model it that way. If you stacked cannonballs, right, so one on top of each other, specific radii, right, because you stack them up, and then there's a little sphere, you can insert another sphere in between. There's a coding theory kind of an analogy here. And then there's a little gap, and you can squeeze in another. So there's a particular distribution of radii that will give you maximum packing, right? I'm sure you've done it in Bruce's course or your course or something like that. So you model everything as a sphere, then what you do is run this magnesium oxide through a Ceph. So there are all these radii R1, radii R2, radii R3. 3 scoops of this plus 1 scoop of that plus 3 teaspoons of this. Shake the whole thing and put it in. It worked, right? So there, if you sat there and had it, oh, in real life, nothing is spherical, you guys have modeled as spheres. Well, it worked. So it's okay. Go do the problem. Once in a while, blatant approximations work a long way, so it's okay. I think that's the fun of being a grad student or being a researcher, right? We all know when we made mistakes and we'll correct them, but by and large, don't be shy. Go ahead. Everything in the world is a sphere. Everything is a point mass. It's okay.
I think I'll try it out after.
I think we got time for one more question.
All right. So it seems like right now in engineering we deal with a weird mix of math, theory, and practical applications, and we're all, as students, we're all kind of confused often about, where do we focus, where do we spend time? And then from these comments, I was thinking, it seems like these days we build projects and we build results in a hierarchical way, right? We start with some small theoretical thing, and then we add real-life complications to it and see if it does something well. In this process, how can we, but we're not prepared to deal with this kind of interfacing between these modules and theoretical and real-world things. Is there any way we can get more prepared, or a lot of us will be faculty sometime soon. Is there any way we can help people be more prepared for this kind of hierarchical, complex system development that goes on in engineering these days?
Look at me. I thought that was your guys' question. Seriously, I'm looking at you guys.
I guess, the first thing to say is practice, right? I mean, hopefully we try. Hopefully we succeed in giving you guys the opportunity actually to kind of explore, these interfaces. Sometimes maybe we get so carried away trying to get the next paper out, the next deadline or something, we may kind of neglect certain facets of things. But I think there's no substitute for just trying. In some sense, grad school, at least in electrical engineering, it's still kind of the apprentice model, right? In some sense, you're apprentice to your advisor, and you're basically kind of learn how to do kind of research or engineering or whatever the way they do it. It's still very much kind of the medieval approach to education. In some sense, I think, at the research level, we've never really learned to, these classes on creativity or classes on stuff. We haven't figured out how to kind of encapsulate that in a junior level, 300 level class and teach it. So. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
It must be practice. I'm sitting here trying to contemplate it about this, and I think for me, it's just been maturity. As I've gotten older, I've realized how these puzzle pieces fit together, and I don't know what it is that helped me realize this, but maybe it is practice and just experience that as you go along, you start to realize how different elements come and play together and how to leverage that. I don't know how to teach it or train it or necessarily.
I agree about maturity. If you look, there are statistics as to different professions when they peak in terms of productivity. So for mathematicians, that can be very young, and physicists as well, 18 to 20 some. And if you're 25 and you haven't made a breakthrough, you're dead as a physicist. But for engineers, actually, they peak around 40 and so on, 50. Now, why is that? Well, maybe it is exactly putting those complexities of theory and practice and realism and so on together in a productive way that takes a while to mature. So that would be one thing. Wait until you get white hair and things will be fine.
Well, I think over time you get exposure to new problems and new opportunities that then you start to see these connections better, I think.
Yeah, but I think that more could be done. I know, for example, that in the statistics department, they have statistical consulting where students are involved in consulting projects. I think something like that could be instituted in engineering. It's a natural thing to do, certainly for students at the PhD level, where consulting projects would be brought to groups of students and maybe under faculty guidance and worked on. That could be something, maybe a special course like that could be developed, a consulting type course, and I think that might be of interest.
So you have collaborations with universities sometimes, or projects that you fund?
Yep, several.
So have you been able to engage like the grad students in kind of the problems? Have you found that it was, because it seemed to me a natural thing would be if say there was research that was being supported by a company or something, but it had sort of a real goal, and it's sort of through the interactions with the company and kind of the feedback, the applications and stuff, that might be a good vehicle for kind of learning such things.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have 4 or 5 ongoing collaborations that I'm involved in personally with universities, and for each of those we have at least monthly meetings where I either see or talk on the phone with the professor and the student, and usually the student's the one doing all the talking, and we're giving them guidance about why what they're doing is right or wrong, or how they should do things differently, what better assumptions they could make, and so on. So I think our interactions have been most successful where we have that kind of interaction that often. If we let it go 3 months, 6 months, then it's more of a disaster from our side.
Right. So yeah, maybe a model that's a little bit more engaged with, somehow if there were a way that weren't quite so ivory tower, and people were a little bit more engaged with, in some ways, still students here, but engaged a little bit more with industry problems, that might be better for bridging that gap.
Yeah, for sure. We, wherever possible, it's limited by funding and all kinds of other constraints as well, but wherever possible, we try and bring students in for some period of time. Like just this week, we have a student from Clemson who's visiting my lab, and they're working with my guys for a week at a time, something like that. So those kind of interactions are invaluable, I think.
Yeah, I've had a number of students go for an internship for a summer, and that seems to have a similar effect when they get an opportunity to work in industry and on those problems. Often they're not even able to tell me exactly what they did because there are some confidentiality issues, but that exactly gives no opportunity to industry to really let them in on a project and get them involved. So I think that can be a good experience.
In my early years as professor, you kind of get, want to interact with industry so I could get some research funding from it. I guess more recently I've kind of come to realize that there's just so much value in terms of being, sort of told what the real problems are and stuff that, like Ogisa was saying, I'll often sort of, I'll do a fair amount of engagement with people from industry just kind of, for free, if you will, because it just, there's so much to be learned from it. So I don't know if you ever have any opportunities to, if you can spend a certain fraction of your time sort of, if you get that opportunity, take advantage of it. It's worth the investment, even without kind of any kind of immediate return. But it's something that just until we figure out a magic way to kind of teach creativity or teach design or teach kind of system engineering or teach this stuff, as you said, a lot of it's just experience. I mean, I'm better at sort of connecting research problems to kind of real problems and abstracting stuff. I'm a lot better than I was when my first few years here. And if I'd known then how bad I was, I might have been discouraged and never continued. But there's no substitute for experience, I think.
Following on something you just said about doing work with industry partners wherever you can, even if it's without funding, I think actually that's been a success story too in some of the work that I've had with some of my university collaborators. Is that starts out, in certain situations they might approach you and say, hey, we'd like to get funding for this project, and they describe the project, and you're like, that's a wacky project. Why would I fund that? But in other cases, there have been people who approach me and say, I don't need any money now. I got a little bit of money I can work on, and I got this problem. And then you start talking to them, and you redirect the problem a little bit with them, and eventually you get to something. And then by the time you've worked with them for 3 or 6 months or a year, suddenly it's morphed into a problem that is really valuable. And then it becomes much easier to be able to fund them. And so it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, sort of walking somebody else's shoes and doing their simple problems for them and helping them out, and that really builds a relationship, and then more problems will come your way. I think it's the same lesson that we talked about before. So.
Okay, that's all the time we've got for this afternoon. Let's thank our panelists. And Jay's got some concluding remarks for this.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just want to acknowledge all the people who have contributed to making this conference a success. So firstly, I'd like to thank all the invited speakers, Professor Hayek for his talk, Professor Michael Jordan, Professor Asu Osdagler, and Dr. Tony Phillips for all the interesting talks. And I also thank Vodafone for their financial support, and also all the student speakers and all the panelists for their participation. And the student members of the organizing committee who were actively involved in organizing the conference were Anand Muralidhar, Gayatri Mohan, Sriram Kannan, Neera Jain, Heather Arneson, Adnan Raja, Sivakumar Gurantla, Hemant Kaushik, and Nick Ferris. We also received a lot of help from the CSL supporting staff members, including Terry, Barbara, Dan Jordan, and Michael Chan, who's doing the video for us. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Hayek for his constant support and encouragement that has really kept this conference going. And thank you all for attending.